The sky above Saigon was burning. Smoke rose from the embassy district, curling into the orange morning light as helicopters thundered overhead. It was April 1975, and the war was ending one rooftop at a time. Marines shouted orders over the sound of engines while evacuees fought to reach the last flights out. Papers burned in the streets, flags fell from poles, and the city that had once been called the Pearl of the East was collapsing into chaos. Amid the confusion, one man stood still. His name was known only to those who had served beside him, a Green Beret, hardened by years in the highlands, where the jungle was thicker and the rules fewer. While the last Americans boarded their helicopters, he walked in the opposite direction. His orders had been clear: evacuate immediately. But duty was not what kept him here. It was a promise. Somewhere beyond the city, deep in the central highlands, men he had trained and fought beside, the Montagnard tribes, were still waiting for him. He had told them he would never leave. The embassy gates trembled under the weight of the desperate crowd. Families screamed, children reached for outstretched hands, and the roar of departing helicopters drowned out everything else. But the Green Beret had already disappeared into the maze of alleys leading away from the compound. Each step carried him farther from safety and deeper into a country about to change forever. As the sun climbed higher, the tanks began to roll. The North Vietnamese army pushed through the city's streets, their treads crushing cars and debris. Flags with yellow stars flooded from their turrets. The fall of Saigon was no longer a prediction, it was happening in real time. Yet for the Green Beret, the war was not over. He slipped through side streets, past abandoned villas and bodies half buried in rubble. His uniform was gone, replaced with local clothing. His weapon, a rifle taken from a fallen soldier, hung hidden beneath a ragged cloak. By nightfall, Saigon was no longer the capital of South Vietnam. The presidential palace had fallen. The embassy was silent. Radio transmissions faded into static. The evacuation had ended, but in the jungle, another story was beginning. The Green Beret crossed the river under cover of darkness, leaving the city lights behind. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of forest and the people he had sworn to protect. He moved like a ghost through the countryside, avoiding checkpoints, sleeping in ditches, drinking from muddy streams. Villagers whispered rumours of a lone American moving through the fields at night. Some said he was lost. Others believed he was a soldier refusing to surrender. To the new government, he was a traitor. To his friends in the mountains, he was a promise kept alive. The jungle waited for him, vast and silent, its canopy still scarred from years of bombing. The path was filled with danger. Patrols searching for stragglers, wild animals drawn by the scent of death, hunger stalking every mile. But none of it mattered. His war was not with survival. It was with his own word. He would return to the Montagnards, or he would die trying. Behind him, Saigon lay in ruins, a city swallowed by victory and defeat all at once. Ahead, the mountains rose like a dark wall against the horizon. The air was heavy with rain and the promise of thunder. Somewhere out there, his people were waiting, hiding from the soldiers now hunting them. The Green Beret disappeared into the jungle as the last echoes of the war faded behind him. For the rest of the world, the conflict had ended. For him, it had just begun. Long before the fall of Saigon, before the final helicopters rose into the smoke, the Green Beret had already decided his fate. His name was whispered among the special forces as one of those men who never broke under pressure, never complained, and never forgot his mission. He had spent years in the central highlands, where the mountains met the clouds and the war was fought on foot, one ridge at a time. He had arrived in Vietnam when the war was still young. Back then the jungles were thick and the enemy was unseen, slipping through bamboo and mist like ghosts. He was sent to train the Montagnard tribes, the indigenous people who lived far from the cities and fought with ancient weapons and unshakable loyalty. They were farmers and hunters, small in stature but fierce in battle. When the Green Berets came, they found in the Montagnards something rare. Allies who fought not for politics but for survival. Over time, the Green Beret and his Montagnard fighters became family. He learned their language, their customs, their ways of moving through the jungle without a sound. He ate what they ate, slept under the same stars, and bled beside them. Together they built camps deep in the highlands, teaching modern warfare to men who had once hunted with spears. The enemy feared them. The US command admired them. And to the Green Beret, they were more than soldiers, they were brothers. But as the years dragged on, the war began to rot from within. Orders came from faraway officers, detached from the mud and blood of the jungle. Political games replaced strategy. Promises made to the tribes were slowly forgotten. When the American withdrawal began, the Green Beret saw what was coming long before the rest. The Montagnards were being left behind. He had tried to fight it, sending messages, calling in favours, demanding that evacuation plans include his men and their families. But when the final order came, it was clear there would be no rescue. The tribes were on their own. Many of his fellow soldiers accepted it as inevitable. He could not. For him, loyalty didn't end when the papers were signed. It ended when the last man was safe. As Saigon fell, he had a choice: fly out with the others or vanish into the jungle. For him, there was no choice at all. He had lived among the Montagnards too long to abandon them now. They had risked their lives for his, carried him through firefights, nursed his wounds, buried his friends. When he told them he would stay, they believed him. And when the last helicopter lifted off, he proved it. He left behind everything that tied him to his old world: his uniform, his dog tags, his name. He carried only what mattered: a rifle, a knife, a few supplies, and the memory of those who had fallen. In the chaos of Saigon's final hours, he slipped away unnoticed, blending into the mass of civilians heading north and west. Some said it was madness, others called it betrayal. But to him, it was something simpler: honour, the kind that doesn't fit inside orders or medals, the kind that binds men long after wars are supposed to end. For years, stories would circulate among refugees and soldiers alike. An American living in the mountains, bearded and silent, wearing tribal clothes and speaking the Montagnard language like a native. They said he moved like a shadow through the jungle, carrying an old M16 that never left his hands. Some believed he was a ghost, a myth born from the guilt of a war no one wanted to remember. But in the highlands, they knew better. To the Montagnards, he was real, a soldier who had kept his word when everyone else had broken theirs, the man who wouldn't leave. The jungle swallowed him whole. After Saigon's collapse, the Green Beret moved westward, deeper and deeper into the central highlands, a place where the map turned to nothing but green and rivers carved their own paths through the mountains. The roads were gone now, blown apart or blocked by wreckage. Abandoned tanks rusted in the tall grass. Villages stood silent, their thatched roofs caved in, their fires long cold. The war had ended, but the land still trembled from its memory. He travelled at night, sleeping beneath the roots of ancient trees or in the shell craters left by bombs. His food came from what he could hunt or trade, his water from the streams that cut through the jungle's heart. Each sound, the cry of a bird, the crack of a branch, sent a pulse through his nerves. The North Vietnamese patrols were everywhere now, sweeping the countryside for stragglers, collaborators, and Americans who had been left behind. He had become one of those ghosts they hunted. Days bled together into an endless march of heat, mud, and silence. The jungle was a living thing, wet, heavy, and watching. Vines pulled at his boots, leeches clung to his skin. His uniform had turned to rags, his boots to shreds, yet he kept moving. He knew the highlands like few others did. Every trail, every river bend, every mountain ridge. Somewhere ahead, beyond the flooded valleys, the Montagnard villages waited. He crossed the ruins of old camps, special forces outposts that once flew the Green Beret flag. They were nothing now but bones of wood and wire, swallowed by moss. The silence there was suffocating. He paused at one site where he had once trained fighters years earlier. The camp's sign still hung crooked on a fence post, bullet holes punched through the letters. He touched it once, then moved on. The past had no place here. The first time he saw movement in the distance, his hand went instinctively to his rifle. Figures moved through the mist, lean, barefoot men with crossbows slung over their backs. Montagnards. For a moment, time folded in on itself. They froze when they saw him, this ragged stranger stepping from the trees, his face hollow from hunger but his eyes alive with purpose. Then recognition sparked. They knew him. He had returned. The journey had taken weeks, maybe months. Time had lost meaning. When they led him back to their village, children peeked from behind huts, whispering as they stared at the foreigner who spoke their language better than some of their own. The elders came to greet him, their faces lined with years of war. They thought all Americans had gone. Yet here he was, one man, tired and scarred, standing in the place he had once called home. That night, the jungle seemed to breathe again. Fires flickered across the village. The Montagnards shared their food with him, silent at first, then slowly speaking of what had happened since the Americans left. The soldiers had come, not from the south but from the north. They burned crops, searched homes, and dragged away anyone accused of helping the US. The villagers had survived by hiding in the forest, moving when the patrols came too close. The Green Beret listened, his expression unreadable. Every story was a wound reopened. He realised then that his war had only changed shape. It wasn't about missions or objectives anymore. It was about keeping these people alive, the people who had once fought beside him. Outside, the wind swept through the trees like the low hum of engines long gone. The jungle had claimed everything, but it hadn't taken their will to survive, and neither had it taken his. In the morning, he rose before dawn, staring at the mist that hung low over the mountains. Somewhere beyond that haze was the rest of the world, the one that had already forgotten. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There would be no going back now. The Green Beret had come home, just not to the one he left behind. The jungle had no clocks, no calendars, only the rhythm of rain and the whisper of wind through the trees. Days turned to weeks, and the Green Beret became part of the forest once again. The Montagnards had taken him in without question, just as they had years before. To them, he was not an outsider but a brother who had returned from the smoke and ruin of the lowlands. The village lay deep in the highlands, surrounded by mist and silence. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth. The huts were built on stilts, their walls woven from bamboo, their fires glowing like embers in a sea of green. Life moved slowly here, hunting, planting, repairing what the war had left behind. But even in peace, the sound of helicopters still haunted the people's dreams. The Green Beret shed what remained of his old life piece by piece. His uniform was replaced with tribal clothes. His weapon, once polished and precise, became another tool among many. The years of command and discipline gave way to quiet observation. He learned to fish with nets instead of line, to gather roots and wild herbs, to track movement by the sound of a single leaf breaking underfoot. But the jungle never forgot what it had seen. Every now and then, distant gunfire echoed through the hills, the new government's patrols, searching for those who had once fought for America. The Montagnards called them ghosts in uniform. When word came that soldiers were near, the village vanished in hours. Fires were smothered, paths covered, homes abandoned to the vines. The Green Beret led the children through the forest to the hidden caves he had once used during the war. He knew how to make their footprints disappear, how to mask the scent of smoke, how to move like a shadow between trees. In those moments, the old soldier returned. His instincts were sharp, his movements calculated, his eyes always scanning. The war was gone, but survival was still the mission. Seasons shifted. The monsoon came and went. The rivers swelled, washing away what little roads remained. Crops grew again, cautiously. The Montagnards rebuilt their lives from fragments. And through it all, the Green Beret stayed. He repaired tools, trained the young hunters, and told stories of a world beyond the jungle. A world that once promised them safety and never delivered. Sometimes when the sky cleared, he climbed the highest ridge and looked west, toward the horizon where the sun sank behind layers of blue mountains. Beyond those ridges lay Thailand and freedom. He could have left if he wanted to. A few days' journey and he might have found a refugee camp, a way back to the world he once knew. But he didn't move. His home was here now, among the people who had never betrayed him. He was no longer a soldier of a country, he was a guardian of a people. The Montagnards began to speak of him in reverent tones. Children whispered stories about the tall foreigner who had once fallen from the sky and now watched over them. Hunters swore he could track a man through rain without leaving a single print. Some said he could hear danger before it arrived. To outsiders, these were myths. To the Montagnards, they were truths woven into survival. Years passed like fog, slow, shapeless and quiet. The Green Beret's hair turned grey, his beard long and wild. The scars on his arms and face faded into the deep lines of age. He moved slower now, but with the same purpose. Each dawn found him by the edge of the river, staring at his reflection rippling across the surface. A stranger who had once been a soldier, now a man with no flag and no nation. Yet beneath the calm, something still burned. He had not forgotten the friends who never made it out, the promises broken, the lies buried under silence. The jungle had healed many wounds, but not that one. And so he stayed. Because the world beyond these trees had abandoned its honour, but in this place, forgotten by maps, ruled by the rhythm of rain, it still lived. He had become part of the legend now, the soldier who stayed behind. By the late 1970s, the jungle had gone quiet, but the quiet was deceiving. Beneath the calm canopy, the war still breathed, just slower now, like an old beast that refused to die. For the Green Beret, peace had never come. It only changed shape. The Montagnards still lived under threat. Government troops swept through the highlands, hunting those accused of collaborating with the Americans. Entire villages were uprooted. Men were taken for questioning and never returned. Those who survived learned to move constantly, to disappear when the sound of engines echoed in the distance. The Green Beret knew how to fight a war without front lines. He trained the younger men in ambush tactics, how to set traps, how to move in the dark without leaving a trail. He built small caches of weapons hidden in bamboo groves, remnants of an older fight now repurposed for survival. He no longer saw himself as a soldier in uniform, only as a protector of the people who had given him a reason to stay alive. He had become a ghost of war, guiding others through the ruins of an empire's broken promise. The North Vietnamese soldiers called him the American spirit of the mountains. They never said his name, no one knew it anymore. But they knew his mark. Patrols that never returned, trails that led nowhere, the whisper of movement just beyond sight. His war was fought in silence, unseen and unclaimed. Sometimes he wondered if he was keeping the war alive by refusing to let it die. But every time he saw a child cry when soldiers came too close, or a family forced to burn their own fields to stay hidden, he knew his cause had never ended. It had simply been forgotten by everyone else. The Montagnards began to fade from memory outside the jungle. Refugees fled across the Mekong, carrying stories of the American who still lived in the highlands. Some said he was dead. Others said he had become more myth than man, a spirit who appeared when danger came and vanished like smoke. At night, he sat by the fire and listened to the jungle hum, the sounds of insects and wind mixed with the faint rhythm of drums from distant villages. Sometimes he dreamed of the past, the roar of helicopters, the static of radio chatter, the smell of cordite and rain. He would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, his hand reaching instinctively for a rifle that was no longer beside him. He carried the war inside him, the way a wound carries its memory. The seasons kept turning. The monsoons returned, washing away the traces of roads and trails. The rivers rose and fell, carving new paths through the earth. Time blurred. To the outside world, he no longer existed. His name was struck from lists, his record sealed or forgotten. But in the mountains, he was still there, living proof that not every soldier came home when the war ended. He began to lose track of years. The jungle gave everything he needed: food, shelter, purpose. His skin had darkened, his body hardened again, his mind sharpened by solitude. He no longer thought like the man he once was. The past was a dream fading into the mist. Yet sometimes when the wind shifted, he would catch a faint sound from beyond the hills, the distant drone of aircraft, too high to see. It stirred something deep within him. Memories of another world, the world he had left behind. He wondered what they said about him now, if they remembered his name, if they told the truth, or if they too had buried him beneath the silence. The Green Beret looked out over the mountains, endless, green and eternal. Somewhere down there, men were still fighting, not for nations or flags, but for survival. The war had changed, but it had never truly stopped, and neither had he. By the early 1980s, whispers began to spread through the jungles and refugee camps of Southeast Asia, whispers of an American who had never left. Traders spoke of a tall, bearded man seen among the Montagnards in the remote highlands, carrying an old rifle and wearing tribal clothes. Soldiers on patrol claimed they had glimpsed him moving through the mist, vanishing into the trees before they could fire. To the villagers, he was not just a man anymore, he was a myth. For the Green Beret, anonymity had become armour. The jungle shielded him from the world's gaze, but it also erased him. He was no longer part of any military, no longer tied to tied to any government. He existed in the narrow space between life and legend. The Montagnards called him the man in the shadows, the one who watched over them when the soldiers came, the one who appeared without a sound and disappeared just as quickly. He built his refuge high above the valleys, where the clouds touched the mountain tops. The small hut was made of bamboo and earth, hidden by vines and leaves. From there he could see everything: the trails winding through the forest, the smoke from distant villages, the movement of patrols far below. It was the same kind of vantage point he had used during the war, when he guided airstrikes from secret ridges. Only now there were no radios, no aircraft, no reinforcements. Just one man and the weight of memory. Occasionally strangers would arrive, smugglers, missionaries, or aid workers who had strayed too far. Some swore they saw him. Others said they only heard his voice, low and rough, warning them to leave. A few told stories of an American helping the Montagnards fight off bandits or government troops, but no one could prove it. No photographs, no records, no name. Just rumours carried by wind and fear. In the outside world, reporters began hearing fragments of his story. Refugees in Thailand spoke of the forgotten soldier, a Green Beret who stayed behind when the last helicopters fled Saigon. The CIA dismissed it as myth. The Pentagon had no file on him. Officially, he didn't exist. But for those who had fought in the highlands, the tale felt too real to ignore. In the shadows of bureaucratic denial, the legend grew. Some said he had gone mad, unable to live in a world without war. Others said he had found peace the only way a soldier could, by disappearing into the land he understood best. But the truth was more complicated. The Green Beret had not vanished out of madness or guilt. He had stayed because his mission had never truly ended. The Montagnards were still hunted, still displaced, still trying to survive. And he had made them a promise. Sometimes when the moon rose over the canopy, he would sit by a small fire and listen to the sounds of the jungle, the chorus of insects, the distant calls of night birds, the wind brushing through the trees. It was in those moments that his mind wandered to the world beyond. He wondered if anyone back home had remembered the tribes that fought and died for an ally that never came back. He doubted it. The war had become history now, the kind printed in books that never mentioned names like his. Yet even as the world forgot, he endured. His beard had turned white, his hair thin and tangled, his body lean but strong. He no longer measured time in years, only in seasons, the wet and the dry, the living and the dead. He knew every tree, every path, every hidden stream. He could move through the jungle faster than men half his age. To those who caught glimpses of him, he looked like something from another time, a relic of a war that refused to die. To the Montagnards, he was more than that. He was the last link to the world that had once promised them freedom. The man in the shadows had become the jungle's secret, a ghost of loyalty, a soldier without a country. And somewhere, far beyond those mountains, his legend began to reach the ears of men who had long thought him dead. It began with a rumour. A faded photograph passed between aid workers in Thailand. The image showed a thin, grey-haired man standing beside a group of Montagnards, his face weathered, his eyes steady. The picture was grainy, but something in his stance, in the way he carried himself, felt unmistakable. Someone whispered his name. Others dismissed it. But the story spread. An American soldier, still alive. By the mid-1990s, the war was 2 decades gone, its ghosts scattered across continents. Most of the world had moved on. Vietnam was opening its borders again, journalists were returning, veterans were coming back to find closure. But for a small circle of men in the US Special Forces community, the rumour hit like a thunderclap. They had heard the stories before, myths of lost soldiers, of men who couldn't let go. But this one felt different. The details were too precise. The mountains, the tribes, the scars. A humanitarian team travelling through the Central Highlands confirmed it. They had met an American living among the Montagnards, barefoot, bearded and silent. He refused to give his name but spoke fluent tribal dialects. When they asked where he came from, he simply said, "Here." They didn't believe him until one of the elders pulled out an old photograph, a young Green Beret in jungle fatigues, standing beside Montagnard fighters during the war. The face was the same. The lines were deeper, the eyes older, but the man had not vanished at all. He had simply stopped existing in the world that kept records. When word reached the US, officials scrambled to confirm the claim. They sent inquiries through diplomatic channels, checked missing in action lists, and reopened files long considered closed. Nothing fit perfectly, but too many details matched. His unit, his disappearance, his ties to the Montagnards. In the jungle, the man remained unfazed. For him, the outside world was a distant echo. He had no interest in returning. The tribe had become his life, his family, his mission, his identity. He lived as they did, hunted as they did, prayed as they did. The war that once tore their world apart had, in a strange way, bound them together forever. When representatives finally reached him, he listened quietly as they spoke of home, of medals and ceremonies, of the chance to tell his story. He didn't answer. The jungle around them was alive with sound. Birds, insects, the hum of wind through leaves. After a long silence, he said only that his home was here, and that he had nothing left to go back to. He agreed to travel down from the mountains for the first time in decades, only as far as the nearest town. The villagers watched as he left, barefoot, carrying a walking stick carved from bamboo. Children ran beside him until the edge of the forest. When he turned back, the mist had already swallowed their village. In the town, the people stared. He looked like no one else, a man between worlds, carrying the weight of 2 lifetimes. The reporters tried to speak to him, but he said little. His English had grown rough, his sentences short and deliberate. When someone asked if he regretted staying, he shook his head. There was nothing to regret, he said. He had made a promise, and he had kept it. He stayed for only a few days before vanishing again into the highlands. No one knows exactly when he died or where. Some say he was buried beneath the trees by the Montagnards he called family. Others believe he simply disappeared into the forest, as he always had, one last time. When news of his story reached the United States, it caused a brief stir. A few headlines, a handful of interviews with those who remembered his name. Then, as quickly as it came, the world moved on again. But for those who had fought beside him, and for the tribes who had sheltered him, his story never ended. He had become something larger than a soldier, a symbol of loyalty that outlived a war, a man who kept his word when governments and nations did not. He did not die in battle, or return in triumph. He simply stayed. The jungle was his home, the war was his shadow, and the legend of the man who never left would echo through the highlands long after the world forgot his name. The jungle does not keep records, but it remembers. Long after the guns went silent, and the world stopped speaking of Vietnam, whispers still floated through the highlands, stories of an American who never came home. The villagers called him the ghost captain, the silent brother, the man who stayed when the sky fell. No one agreed on when he died, or if he had died at all. But they all agreed on one thing: he had never truly left. The Montagnards kept his memory alive in their stories. Around fires at night, elders spoke of the tall foreigner who had fought beside them when the war seemed endless. They told of how he returned when everyone else fled, how he lived among them, hunted with them, taught their sons to defend their homes. Children grew up hearing his name not as a soldier, but as a guardian spirit who protected the mountains. In time, the story no longer belonged to one man. It belonged to the land itself. In America, his tale surfaced now and then. A half-page story buried in a magazine, a mention in a documentary, a question asked at a veterans reunion. Some dismissed it as legend. Others, especially those who had served in the highlands, felt a deep ache of recognition. They knew men like him, men who had given everything to a war that gave nothing back. For them, the story of the soldier who stayed behind was not unbelievable. It was inevitable. The truth, if it could be found at all, was scattered like ashes across time. No body, no grave. Only traces. An old rifle found near a forgotten trail. A carved totem in the shape of a Green Beret insignia. A photograph in a refugee's hands showing a man with weathered eyes and a faint, knowing smile. Maybe it was him. Maybe it wasn't. It no longer mattered. Because his story had already crossed from history into myth. The villagers said his spirit still walked the ridgelines at night, guiding lost hunters back to safety. They said that when soldiers entered the forest, they sometimes found footprints too large to be their own, vanishing into the mist. To the Montagnards, he was part of the mountains now, as real as the wind, as silent as the trees. In a world that measures wars by victories and losses, his story refused both. He fought not for politics or pride, but for loyalty, a promise made in the dirt, far from the men who made speeches about peace. He stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning everything he believed in. The United States never officially recognised him. No medals, no memorial, no folded flag. His name, if ever spoken, was lost to time. But perhaps that was fitting. He had lived beyond names, beyond nations, beyond the definitions of hero or deserter. He had become something purer, the embodiment of a single, impossible vow kept long after the world had moved on. Decades later, the war's scars still run through the mountains he once called home. Bomb craters filled with water, unexploded shells buried in the soil. But in the midst of that quiet devastation, life continues. The Montagnards still plant rice, still hunt, still tell the stories that hold their past together. And in those stories, the American is always there, standing in the rain, rifle slung over his shoulder, watching the horizon for danger that will never fully disappear. Somewhere deep in the jungle, time stopped for him. The war ended everywhere else, but not in his heart, not in those hills. They called him the man who stayed behind. But perhaps it was the world that left, and he simply remained true to what it had forgotten. His story is a reminder that wars don't end when the fighting stops. Some continue quietly, in memory, in loyalty, in the ghosts that refuse to fade. And somewhere in the endless green of the highlands, where the mist hides the mountains and the rivers still carry echoes of gunfire, the legend endures, of one soldier, one promise, and one war that never really ended. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I always read what you think. Hit like if you learned something new, and subscribe so you don't miss the next untold story of war, courage, and survival. Turn on the bell for more history brought to life. See you in the next one.